The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 7, Dissociation, Numbness, and Quiet Absence, when leaving the moment feels safer than staying. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored emotional hijacking and false certainty. What happens when feeling becomes so intense, so charged, so convincing, that it starts masquerading as truth. We looked at panic, jealousy, outrage, shame, conviction, and the way strong emotion can narrow awareness until one interpretation feels absolute. But not all overwhelm becomes louder. Not all distress becomes visible. Not all self-protection comes through intensity. Not all suffering announces itself in raised voices, tears, panic, arguments, or collapse. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the system does not become more charged. It becomes more distant, more flat, more quiet, more absent. This absence can be much harder to recognize, partly because it often looks functional from the outside. A person may still be speaking, answering, working, caregiving, showing up, smiling when required, and doing what needs to be done. They may still look composed, sensible, manageable, even mature, but inwardly, something essential may have thinned, not destroyed, not gone forever, but harder to reach. That is what this episode is about. Not emotional flooding, but emotional distance. Not moral heat, but a quiet absence. Not the certainty of activation, but the protective dimming of contact. Because one of the most misunderstood things about human consciousness is that protection does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like a disappearance. Sometimes the mind and body do not defend themselves by becoming louder or more reactive. Sometimes they defend themselves by reducing access to feeling, to memory, to immediacy, to the body, to the moment, even to the sense of self. And if we do not understand that, we will misread a great deal of human experience. We will mistake numbness for indifference, distance for peace, flatness for strength, detachment for maturity, calmness for regulation, and outward function for inward presence. But those things are not always the same. A person can look calm and be shut down. A person can look strong and be unreachable. A person can look fine and feel unreal. A person can remain outwardly available while inwardly far away. This is why the subject matters so much, because many people not only struggle with too many feelings, many struggle with too little access to feeling, too little access to themselves, too little access to the direct, alive, embodied experience of being here, and often they do not call it dissociation. They call it being tired, being fine, being over it, being independent, being practical, being numb, being blank, being in a weird mood, feeling nothing, not knowing what they feel, not really caring anymore. Sometimes they call it peace. That last one matters, because one of the great confusions in modern life is that quiet absence can sometimes feel cleaner than pain. It can feel less chaotic than overwhelming, less embarrassing than needed, less dangerous than grief, less complicated than anger, less destabilizing than contradiction. And because it feels quieter, many people assume it must be healthier, but quiet is not always peace. Sometimes, quiet is what remains when the system no longer knows how to stay fully present to what is happening. So in this episode, I want to slow all of that down. I want to look at what dissociation actually is in everyday life, not only in the clinical or dramatic sense. I want to explore numbness, low-grade detachment, going flat, quiet absence, functional distance, and the strange ways people can continue living while feeling partly removed from the life they are living. I want to explore why the mind and body leave the moment, what this protects, what it costs, and how we can begin to recognize absence without turning that recognition into another way of attacking ourselves. Because this is important too. The point is not to shame numbness. The point is not to say that if I go quiet, something is wrong with me. The point is not to romanticize constant emotional intensity as proof of being alive. And the point is certainly not to make anyone feel broken because they have learned how to survive through distance. The point is understanding, because when something is understood more clearly, it becomes easier to meet with honesty. And when it is met with honesty, the possibility of return begins to appear. That is where this episode is heading, into absence, into quietness, into flattening, into functional distance, into the forms of overwhelm that do not look dramatic enough to be recognized easily, but that still shape whole lives. Perhaps if we do this well, into a more compassionate understanding of what it means when the self does not rise to meet the moment with force, but instead recedes from it. So that is where we begin, with a truth that many people need to hear far more clearly than they usually do. Not all overwhelmed looks intense. Not all overwhelm looks intense. When most people imagine overwhelm, they imagine something visible. They imagine panic, tears, anger, a breakdown, a meltdown, raised voices, shaking hands, chaotic behavior, a person who can no longer keep it together. And of course, overwhelm can look like that. But some of the deepest forms of overwhelm look nothing like intensity. They look like flatness. They look like the person who says, I don't really feel anything. They look like someone who keeps going through the motions, but cannot quite reach themselves inside them. They look like someone sitting in a conversation, answering well enough, but feeling far away. They look like someone doing the shopping, doing the work, doing the parenting, doing the calls, doing the tasks, doing what has to be done, and yet experiencing the whole thing as though it were happening behind glass. That kind of overwhelm is easy to miss because it does not always disturb the outside world. It may disturb the inner world profoundly, but it often leaves the visible structure intact. The person still turns up, still gets dressed, still does their job, still says thank you, still replies to messages, still appears calm, still looks fine. Because the social surface remains functional, the depth of the struggle may go unnoticed for years, sometimes even by the person themselves. That is one of the reasons this subject matters so much. Not all suffering announces itself in ways that others recognize. Some suffering hides inside composure, some hides inside efficiency, some hides inside emotional flatness, absence, and a strange kind of quiet continuation. Most of us know something about this, even if we have never used the language directly. We know what it is like to look at something that should move us and feel almost nothing. We know what it is like to sit in a room and feel strangely unreal. We know what it is like to nod through a conversation and realize afterwards that we were hardly there. We know what it is like to finish a day and recognize, with a kind of unsettled honesty, that although the body was present for all of it, something more inward had barely arrived. That kind of experience can be deeply confusing, because it does not always feel dramatic enough to justify concern. It may not fit the stories we have about crisis. It may not look bad enough. In fact, many people minimize it precisely because it looks so ordinary. They say, I'm just tired. I'm just a bit checked out. I've had a long day. I think I'm just over it. I don't know, I feel weird. I'm okay, just not really feeling much. But the ordinary quality of the language should not fool us. Sometimes what is being described there is not simply tiredness. Sometimes it is distance. Sometimes it is the system quietly withdrawing access because full presence has become too costly. That can happen for many reasons. Too much stress without recovery. Too much contradiction without resolution. Too much shame without somewhere safe to take it. Too much emotional demand without enough support. Too much role performance. Too much self-suppression. Too much adaptation. Too much life is being managed without enough life being felt. And when that happens, the system may not always explode. Sometimes it disappears quietly. This is the difficult thing to recognize about quiet absence. It often masquerades as normality. A person can be present in body and absent in feeling, present in speech and absent in contact, present in function and absent in self. That is why not all overwhelm looks intense. Sometimes overwhelm looks like nothing much to report, nothing much to say, nothing much to feel, nothing dramatic, just a low-grade sense of being far away from your own life. Because this can feel less chaotic than emotional flooding, some people begin to prefer it, not consciously in most cases, but functionally. Distance can feel easier than raw grief. Flatness can feel easier than panic. Numbness can feel easier than anger. Going quiet can feel safer than staying in full contact with pain, contradiction, uncertainty, humiliation, or helplessness. So the absence becomes protective, not necessarily healthy in the deeper sense, but adaptive. This is where people often misread themselves and each other. They assume the person who is not crying is coping better. They assume the person who sounds calm is more regulated. They assume the one who says I'm fine in a flat voice must truly be fine. They assume that because the reaction is not loud, the pain is not deep. But quietness can be just as protective as intensity, sometimes more so, because intensity still keeps the person in some kind of contact with the fact that something is happening. Quiet absence can erase that contact. It can leave the person not only in pain, but also removed from the very sense of aliveness that would let them recognize the pain clearly. That is why this first part of the episode has to make one thing plain. Overwhelm is not only what breaks visibly. Overwhelm can also be what flattens, what distances, what silences me, what numbs, what allows life to continue externally while reducing access internally. Perhaps one of the most unsettling things about this is that many people can function like this for a very long time. They can become highly competent at low-contact living, highly capable, highly polite, highly role-stable, highly practical, highly adapted, all while carrying a strange and difficult-to-name absence underneath it. That is not because they are empty. This is often because something in them has learned that staying fully present is too much. If that is true, then numbness, distance, and quiet absence are not signs of having no depth. There may be signs of a depth that has become too costly to remain in touch with directly. That is where this episode begins in earnest, with the recognition that some of the deepest forms of overwhelm do not look like intensity. They look like disappearance. Quiet, ordinary, socially acceptable disappearance. Once that becomes visible, the next question naturally follows. What is dissociation, really? And how do we begin to recognize it without turning it into another harsh label or another reason to feel wrong? What is dissociation? Dissociation is one of those words that people often hear, recognize, and misunderstand all at once. Some hear it and think only of the most dramatic clinical extremes, blackouts, total fragmentation, severe trauma states, or experiences so intense that they seem far removed from ordinary life. Others use it so loosely that it starts to mean almost any kind of distraction, zoning out, or emotional discomfort. But if we are going to understand quiet absence properly, we need a more careful definition than either of those. Dissociation is not simply feeling bad. It is not simply being tired. It is not simply being distracted. It is not simply being introverted, calm, private, or emotionally restrained. At its core, dissociation has to do with disconnection. A disconnection in contact, a disconnection in continuity, a disconnection in access, not necessarily a total loss of self, but a thinning of the connection between different parts of experience that would normally feel more integrated. Connection to feeling may weaken. Connection to the body may weaken. Connection to the immediate reality of the moment may weaken. Connection to memory may weaken. Connection to the sense of I am here, and this is happening to me now may weaken. That is why dissociation can feel so strange from the inside. A person may still know where they are. They may still be able to talk. They may still be able to function, and yet something about the experience does not feel fully joined. They may say things like, I feel far away. I feel numb. I feel like I'm watching myself. I know I'm here, but I don't feel fully here. Everything feels flat or unreal. I can't reach what I feel. I can see what's happening, but I'm not really in it. That language matters because it tells us that dissociation is not only about emotion disappearing. It is often about access disappearing. That distinction is extremely important because people often think numbness means there is nothing there, but very often there is a great deal there. There may be fear, grief, conflict, anger, shame, longing, exhaustion, contradiction, helplessness, or overwhelm, but the person can no longer reach it cleanly. The access route has gone dim. The system has reduced contact, not necessarily erased content. That is why dissociation can be one of the most confusing states a person lives through. You may know something matters, but not feel it properly. You may know you are upset, but feel oddly blank. You may know an event was painful, but speak about it as though it happened to someone else. You may know you should feel relief, grief, joy, or anger, and yet feel strangely disconnected from all of it. This is one reason dissociation is so often mistaken for indifference. From the outside, it can look like distance, flatness, or emotional absence. But the absence of visible feeling is not always the absence of impact. Sometimes it is the exact opposite. Sometimes it means the impact has become too great, too layered, too contradictory, or too difficult to process directly, and the system has shifted into distance as a way of managing that overload. That is why it helps to think of dissociation less as a dramatic anomaly and more as a protective alteration in contact. Something becomes too much, or too confusing, or too painful, or too unresolved, or too impossible to metabolize in real time. Instead of becoming louder, the system becomes more distant. Now, dissociation exists on a range. At one end, there are the forms that many people experience occasionally without recognizing them clearly. Driving somewhere and arriving with almost no memory of the journey. Sitting through a conversation and realizing you have drifted so far inwardly that you barely registered what was said. Reading the same paragraph again and again without taking it in. Going through a whole routine, cooking, cleaning, answering messages, working, with very little felt presence inside it. Not all of these experiences are pathological, and not all of them are dissociation in the fullest sense, but they do point towards something important. Consciousness is not always fully integrated. Presence can thin out gradually, and action can continue with very little inward participation. At another level, dissociation becomes more emotional and existential. This is where life can begin to feel flat, distant, or unreal. A person may feel detached from their own reactions, cut off from emotions strangely unreachable to themselves, or as though the world has lost texture and immediacy. They may describe their experience as robotic, foggy, dreamlike, hollow, behind glass, or emotionally muted. The body may still move through ordinary tasks, but the person no longer feels deeply joined to those tasks as a living subject. And then at more severe levels, dissociation can become profoundly disruptive, affecting memory, continuity of self, bodily ownership, emotional access, and a person's sense of reality in ways that significantly impair life. But for this episode, what matters most is that we understand the middle territory, the territory where many people live for years without having a language for it. Not total collapse, not spectacular dysfunction, but low-grade or recurring distance, quiet absence, functional numbness, present in form, absent in feeling. That is where a lot of ordinary suffering hides. This is also why we need to distinguish dissociation from calm. Calm has contact in it. That is one of the clearest ways to tell the difference. A calm person may feel quieter, but they are still reachable. They can still feel it. They can still register nuance. They can still respond from a living center. Their quietness is not emptiness. It is groundedness. There is softness in it, flexibility in it, a capacity to remain with reality without collapsing into urgency or distance. Dissociation can look quiet too, but the quietness is different. It is flatter, less permeable, less available, less joined. A dissociated person may appear calm while actually being cut off. They may sound composed while feeling unreal. They may not be visibly distressed, but that is not because the system is deeply settled. It may be because the system has stepped back from direct participation. This is why the sentence matters so much. Numbness is not the same as peace. The same is true of detachment. Detachment in a healthy sense can mean perspective. It can mean not being swallowed by every passing feeling. It can mean enough inner space to remain aware without being immediately overtaken. There is wisdom in that kind of detachment, but there is another kind of detachment that is not spacious. It is the distance, withdrawal, reduced access, a loosening of immediacy. From the outside, the two can look similar, but from the inside, they are very different. One has awareness in it, the other has an absence in it. That is why some people become confused about whether they are healing or simply going numb. They say, I don't care anymore, and assume that means freedom. They say, nothing really gets to me now, and assume that means maturity. They say I feel detached from everything and assume that means transcendence. But sometimes what they are describing is not regulation. It is a disconnection. This is especially important in cultures that romanticize emotional self-control. Many people are praised for being unbothered, self-contained, hard to shake, cool under pressure, emotionally minimal, or past it. But the absence of visible distress is not always the presence of deep regulation. Sometimes it is reduced access to experience. And that reduced access often arrives for reasons that make sense once we understand protective logic underneath it. A person may go distant because feeling fully is too painful. They may go flat because contradiction is too much to hold. They may go numb because grief cannot yet be metabolized. They may become unreal because the present moment is too saturated with past meaning. They may detach because remaining fully in contact with helplessness, shame, loss, or emotional overload would be unbearable. In that sense, dissociation is not stupidity, weakness, or failure. It is an adaptation, not always an adaptation that serves life well in the long run, not always one that remains benign, but an adaptation all the same. That matters because people are often far too harsh with themselves when they notice these states. They think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I feel properly? Why am I so disconnected? Why am I here but not really here? But many times the more useful question is not, what is wrong with me? It is, what has my system learned to do when full contact feels too costly? That question invites understanding instead of shame. The understanding is crucial here because dissociation often gets maintained by confusion. The less a person understands what is happening, the more frightening it can feel. The more frightening it feels, the more the system may continue relying on distance as protection. So part of the work is simply making the state more readable. To say, this is not necessarily emptiness of character. This is not necessarily a lack of love. This is not necessarily proof that nothing matters. This is not necessarily peace. This may be reduced access, protective absence, a nervous system trying to lower the cost of being here. Once that becomes visible, even dimly, something begins to shift, because noticing absence is already different from being fully lost in it. The person who can say I feel far away is not completely gone. The person who can say I can't reach myself right now has already found a little contact. The person who can say I think I'm here physically, but not emotionally, is already beginning to return. That is why naming matters, not to over-pathologize ordinary life, not to turn every quiet mood into a diagnosis, but to recognize that there are forms of suffering that look like distance rather than heat. If we do not understand them, we will keep expecting all pain to look loud, all distress to look dramatic, and all disconnection to mean indifference. But much of the time, quiet absence is not indifference, it is protection. Once we understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If dissociation is a form of protection, what exactly is the mind and body trying to protect us from when they leave the moment rather than stay fully in it? Why the mind and body leave the moment if dissociation is not simply emptiness, not indifference, not laziness, not weakness, but a protective reduction in access? Then the next question becomes much more important. What is the system protecting us from when it leaves the moment instead of staying fully in it? Because the mind and body do not usually withdraw for no reason. They withdraw when contact becomes too costly, too confusing, too painful, too contradictory, too saturated, too exposing, too impossible to organize in real time. That matters because many people have been taught to think of dissociation in far too narrow a way. They imagine it only as a response to obvious trauma or obvious danger or obvious fear. And of course, threat matters. The preservation of life matters. Acute danger matters. But the reasons a system leaves the moment are often wider and more psychologically complex than that. Sometimes what becomes intolerable is not a single frightening event. Sometimes it is chronic overload. Sometimes shame. Sometimes helplessness. Sometimes the impossibility of expressing what is true. Sometimes emotional contradiction. Sometimes the pressure of holding together a self that no longer feels fully real. Sometimes a life that requires performance long after inward contact has started collapsing. In other words, the system may leave not only because it fears death, but because it cannot bear the form of life it is currently having to live directly. That is a difficult truth, but an important one, because it makes sense of why dissociation can appear in places that do not seem dramatic enough from the outside to deserve the word. A person may not be in immediate physical danger. They may not even look visibly distressed, and still, something in them has learned that full presence is too much. This can begin in childhood, of course. A child may find themselves in an environment where what they feel cannot be expressed safely, or where the emotional atmosphere changes unpredictably, or where closeness is mixed with fear, love with tension, attention with control, care with shame, connection with instability. The child's system cannot simply leave the family, so it learns another solution: leave the moment inwardly. Not all at once, not with a dramatic rupture necessarily, but gradually. Feeling goes dim, body access reduces, a watchful distance develops. The child learns how to remain in the room physically while withdrawing in subtler ways emotionally or perceptually. Once a pattern like that is repeated often enough, the system may continue using it later in life, long after the original environment has passed. That is one path, but it is not the only one. A person may also leave the moment because they are carrying too many incompatible things at once. They love someone, but do not feel safe with them. They need something, but are ashamed of needing it. They want to tell the truth, but fear what the truth will cost. They feel angry, but cannot allow themselves to feel angry. They are exhausted, but do not believe they are allowed to stop. They are hurting, but still have to perform care, politeness, or competence. That kind of contradiction is important, because contradiction is exhausting for the psyche and the body. To hold two incompatible truths consciously at once requires space. It requires capacity. It requires tolerance. And when that tolerance is not available, the system may solve the problem not by integrating the contradiction, but by dimming contact with one or both sides of it. So a person stops feeling clearly, stops knowing clearly, stops accessing the full reality of what is happening in them. Again, that is not stupidity. It is an economy. Painful economy, perhaps. Protective economy. But the economy is all the same. If full contact with contradiction would split the person inwardly, then partial absence may feel safer than full awareness. This is one reason so many people can continue in jobs, relationships, families, and roles that no longer feel wholly livable from the inside. It is not always because they are blind. Sometimes it is because seeing too clearly all at once would demand a change they do not yet know how to survive. That is where dissociation starts making tragic sense. A person may remain because leaving feels impossible, but staying consciously feels impossible too. So the system chooses a third path: stay bodily, leave inwardly. That pattern can happen in workplaces as much as in personal relationships. A person spends years in environments where they are expected to remain useful, composed, responsive, and emotionally manageable. They cannot bring the full truth of what they feel into the room. They cannot afford to break down. They cannot always say no. They cannot always rest. They cannot always protest. They cannot always grieve. So they adapt. At first, perhaps they only numb a little, then more. Then they become highly functional in a strangely distant way. And because the world often rewards that functionality, the protective adaptation gets reinforced. This is where autopilot and dissociation begin to overlap, not because they are identical, but because both can involve functioning without full inward participation. A person may become so practiced at carrying on that they no longer notice how absent they have become. That absence may deepen under chronic stress, because overload does not always produce fire. Sometimes it produces dimming. When the system has been asked to carry too much for too long, intensity itself can become unsustainable. The body and mind cannot remain permanently activated without cost. So in some cases, instead of continuing to escalate, the system reduces access, not because the pressure has been resolved, but because direct contact with the pressure can no longer be metabolized. This is one reason why numbness often follows prolonged overwhelm, because nothing matters, but because too much has mattered for too long. And the same can happen with grief. People often imagine grief as crying, longing, collapse, and visible sadness. And grief can be all of those things. But grief can also become strangely unreal. A person can know that something enormous has happened and yet feel flat, distant, almost untouched in a way that frightens them. They may think, why am I not crying? Why don't I feel more? What's wrong with me? But often, nothing is wrong in the moral sense. The loss may simply be too large to enter all at once. So the system meters access. It lets the person touch the grief in fragments, pulses, flashes, or not at all for a while. Distance is not always the absence of love. Sometimes it is the mind and body making contact survivable. Shame can do something similar. Shame is one of the most powerful forces in human life because it not only hurts, it isolates. It collapses the self inwardly. It can make a person want to disappear while remaining visible. And for some people, the easiest way not to drown in shame is to lose access to themselves a little, to flatten, to go blank, to stop feeling fully how exposed they are. So again, the question is not only, am I afraid? It is also, what would full presence force me to feel right now? Would it force me to feel how trapped I am, how ashamed I am? How much do I want something I cannot ask for? How much do I resent what I keep performing? How much am I carrying? How deeply am I affected? If the answer is yes, then absence begins to make sense. This is also why dissociation can appear in moments of social exposure that seem small from the outside. A room full of people, a difficult conversation, being asked a question, being looked at too closely, being misunderstood, being praised in a way that feels unsafe, being expected to respond before you know what you feel. For one person, these may be tolerable. For another, they may touch an old configuration in which visibility itself feels dangerous. And once visibility feels dangerous, the system may protect by reducing presence. The person may sound flatter, feel unreal, lose words, leave their body slightly, become mechanical, become strangely far away. That is not necessarily a choice in the ordinary sense. It is often a protective shift in state, and this is where nervous system language can be useful, so long as we hold it carefully. Many people find it helpful to speak about hyperarousal and hypoarousal, the body either becoming highly activated or dropping down into a more shut down, flattened, collapsed state. That can be a useful map because it helps people see that not all dysregulation looks like intensity. Some of it looks like a disappearance. Some of it looks like the system conserving itself through distance. But even this map should be held with humility, because the lived reality is often more complex than any one framework. A person may be emotionally numb but physiologically tense, flat on the surface but internally scanning. quiet in expression but chaotic underneath. So rather than turning these ideas into rigid boxes, it is better to let them help us read what is happening. What matters is the principle. Sometimes the system protects life not by increasing access, but by reducing it. That is the line to remember, not because absence is ideal, not because distance is the goal, but because the system is always trying to survive what it cannot yet integrate. This is where dissociation differs from simple distraction too. Distraction is often movement away from something. Dissociation often reduced access to the whole field itself. A distracted person may still feel fully real, while their attention is elsewhere. A dissociated person may feel as though both the world and the self have become strangely thinned out. That thinning can become so familiar that people build identities around it. They call themselves detached, independent, unemotional, stoic, past it, over it, hard to reach, not very deep. Not the kind of person who feels much, but often those identities are. Retrospective stories built around adaptation. The truth may be more like this. I learned to lower contact because contact became too costly. That is a very different sentence. It is sadder, but also truer and much more compassionate, because it reminds us that distance usually began as protection, not failure. Now, protection can become costly. What protects us from pain can also protect us from joy. What protects us from shame can also protect us from intimacy. What protects us from overwhelm can also protect us from aliveness. What protects us from contradiction can also protect us from truth. That is why dissociation is never just helpful or just harmful. It is protective and impoverishing at once. It allows survival, but often at the cost of vividness. It preserves continuity, but often by reducing depth. It keeps the person functioning, but can make it increasingly difficult for them to reach. That is where the deepest sorrow often lives, not simply in pain, but in the quiet loss of access. Loss of access to desire, to grief, to anger, to joy, to bodily certainty, to the direct feeling of being inside one's own life. So when the mind and body leave the moment, they are not necessarily abandoning life. They may be trying to make life bearable. That is why this has to be met with care, not shame, not contempt, not the impatient idea that a person should simply snap out of it or be more present. Presence costs. If someone has learned that the cost of full presence is too high, then the work is not to force presence violently. The work is to understand what made absence feel safer and what conditions might make contact possible again. That is where this part of the episode lands. The mind and body leave the moment when full presence feels too painful, too contradictory, too exposing, too exhausting, or too impossible to organize in real time. They leave not because nothing matters, but often because too much matters. They leave not because the self is weak, but because the self is trying to survive what it cannot yet fully metabolize. And once that becomes visible, the next distinction becomes essential. If quiet absence can look calm from the outside, how do we tell the difference between numbness and real peace? Numbness is not the same as peace. One of the easiest mistakes to make in quiet states is to confuse the absence of noise with the presence of healing, to confuse flatness with steadiness, distance from wisdom, detachment with freedom, shutdown with calm, numbness with peace. That confusion matters because many people live inside it for years. They do not feel chaotic anymore, so they assume they are better. They do not cry as much, so they assume they are healed. They do not react as intensely, so they assume they are regulated. They do not care in the same way they once did, so they assume they have matured. But the absence of visible distress is not always the presence of integration. Sometimes it is simply reduced access. That is the first distinction this section needs to make. Peace has contact in it. Even when peace is quiet, there is still a presence. There is still availability. There is still responsiveness. There is still a living quality to perception. The person is not swallowed by urgency, but neither are they absent. They can feel, but they are not overrun. They can stay with reality without either collapsing into it or withdrawing from it. Numbness is different. Numbness often has less friction, yes, less noise, less drama, less immediate pain, but it also often has less color, less reach, less tenderness, less vitality, less inward participation. A person in numbness may not feel torn apart, but they may not feel fully met by life either. They may not be panicking, but they may not be deeply here. They may not be crying, but they may not be alive to joy, grief, longing, or truth in the same way. That is why numbness can be so deceptive. It is quieter than pain. Quietness is easy to misread as health. This is especially true in a culture that prizes composure. If someone is no longer too emotional, they are often treated as improved. If they no longer react visibly, they are often treated as stronger. If they become harder to shake, harder to move, harder to reach, this can be praised as maturity, discipline, spiritual growth, or emotional intelligence. But composure and absence are not the same as regulation. A person can look composed because they have become less accessible to themselves. They can look mature because they have learned to flatten. They can look spiritual because they no longer visibly struggle. But behind that stillness, there may not be freedom. There may be a distance. This becomes particularly confusing when someone has lived through a long period of emotional chaos. If a person has been highly anxious, emotionally flooded, relationally volatile, or chronically overwhelmed, then the movement into a flatter, quieter state can feel like enormous relief. And in one sense it is relief. The body is no longer paying the same immediate cost of intensity, but relief is not the same as restoration. A person may feel less tortured and still not be fully returned to themselves. That matters because some forms of quiet are earned through integration, and some are achieved through withdrawal. Integration says, I can feel this now without being destroyed by it. Withdrawal says, I can no longer fully reach this, so it no longer tears through me in the same way. From the outside, both may look similar. From the inside, they are worlds apart. A peaceful person can usually stay in contact. They can feel grief and remain present. They can feel love and remain open. They can feel disappointment without collapsing into nothingness. They can remain affected without becoming flooded or shut down. Their quietness is not emptiness, it is groundedness. A numb person often cannot do this in the same way. They may speak about important things with strange flatness. They may feel blank where there should be emotion, and then judge themselves for it. They may describe events that were deeply painful without being able to access the pain directly. They may say they are fine because nothing really gets to them anymore, but what they often mean is that less reaches them. That is not peace, that is protective reduction. Now this is where things can become even more complicated, because many people begin to build a philosophy around their numbness. They call it detachment, or non-attachment, or independence, or being over it, or not letting things affect them, or emotional discipline, or transcendence. And sometimes they truly are moving toward a wiser and less entangled relationship with experience. But sometimes they are simply losing access and giving that loss a flattering name. This is especially important in spiritual or contemplative environments, because there is a real distinction between grounded stillness and psychological withdrawal, but in language, the two can easily get confused. A person may say, I've let go, when what has really happened is, I've gone flat. A person may say, I'm no longer attached, when what has really happened is, I can't fully feel this anymore. A person may say, I'm at peace with it, when what has really happened is, I've lost contact with the part of me that still hurts. That does not mean spiritual traditions are wrong. It means human beings are capable of misreading their own state, especially when a quieter state feels preferable to a more painful one. Contemplative traditions themselves often warn about this. The language differs across traditions, but many distinguish between genuine equanimity and disengaged indifference, between spacious awareness and deadening withdrawal. The danger appears when the quieter state is praised without sufficient attention to whether the person is actually more present or merely less reachable. And this can happen outside of explicitly spiritual language too. It happens in masculinity, in professionalism, in trauma adaptation, in intellectual life, in emotional self-protection. Someone becomes rational because they no longer trust their feelings. Someone becomes low maintenance because the need has become too costly to feel. Someone becomes calm under pressure because they leave the room inwardly when pressure rises. Someone becomes very independent because closeness activates too much risk. Someone becomes hard to impress because wonder has gone dim, along with disappointment. Again, these may all become identity stories built around reduced access. That is one reason this section has to keep returning to contact. Peace still has contact. Numbness often does not. Peace can feel sadness without drowning. Numbness may not feel sadness clearly at all. Peace can rest. Numbness often collapses rather than rests. Peace is permeable. Numbness is often less so. Peace allows intimacy. Numbness often makes intimacy difficult because to be intimate requires access. And perhaps one of the clearest tests is this: can the person feel more than one thing? Real peace often increases capacity. It makes complexity more livable. A peaceful person can feel joy with grief, tenderness with pain, love with fear, uncertainty with steadiness. The field is wider. There is more room for paradox. Numbness usually decreases capacity. It simplifies by reduction. It does not hold the complexity more deeply. It often no longer lets as much in. That is why a numb state can feel easier, but also thinner. A person may say, I feel fine, but the fineness has no depth to it, no brightness, no warmth, no strong distress perhaps, but also no strong aliveness. Life becomes manageable in a muted way. Less dangerous maybe, but less vivid too. This is the tragedy of quiet absence. It can protect the person from pain, while also protecting them from life, from delight, from grief, from longing, from spontaneous affection, from awe, from the ordinary sting and beauty of being here. And because the painful parts are reduced first, the person may not notice the wider cost immediately. They may only notice later that they feel strangely untouched by things that once mattered, unable to cry, unable to love with the same immediacy, unable to want, unable to be surprised, unable to know clearly what they feel. That can create a second layer of suffering. Now the person is not only distant, they are ashamed of being distant. They think something is wrong with them because they cannot access what they think they should feel. But again, the more useful question is not, why am I like this? It is, what has my system done to reduce the cost of being here? That question creates compassion. And compassion matters here because no one finds their way back from numbness through self-contempt. A person does not return to themselves by being scolded for being quiet. They do not recover contact by being told that their flatness is laziness or coldness or failure or bad character. More often, return begins when the quiet state is finally understood clearly enough to stop being misnamed. Not peace, not maturity, not indifference, not the whole truth, but a protective reduction in contact. Once that is seen, something softens. The person may begin to recognize, I am not emotionless. I am hard to reach right now. I am not beyond this. I am distant from it. I am not truly over it. I may be cut off from it. I am not fully at peace. I may be in a quiet form of self-protection. These are painful recognitions in one sense, but they are also hopeful. Because if numbness is not the final truth of the self, then return remains possible. Not instant return, not forced return, not a dramatic recovery all at once, but return in glimpses, a moment of genuine feeling, a sudden wave of grief, a quiet sense of longing, a tear that arrives unexpectedly, a moment where the body feels more alive, a conversation in which something real gets through, a piece of music that reaches what words could not. These moments matter because they remind us that numbness is often not emptiness. It is covered by aliveness under protection, aliveness under distance, aliveness made unreachable for a time. Perhaps that is the deepest truth of this section. The absence of visible distress is not always the presence of regulation. Sometimes it is the cost of surviving too long by going quiet. That is why numbness is not the same as peace. Peace is alive. Numbness is often defended. Peace can stay. Numbness has already left the room a little. And once that difference is understood, the next question becomes even more painful and more necessary. What does it cost to live for too long in that quiet absence, functioning outwardly while inwardly far away, functional but gone? One of the most difficult truths about quiet absence is that a person can remain highly functional while no longer being fully present in their own life. That is what makes this form of suffering so hard to recognize. If someone collapses visibly, the world usually knows something is wrong. If someone is panicking, crying, raging, or breaking down, even if others misunderstand the cause, they can at least see that something is happening. But a person who is functional, organized, productive, polite, and dependable can be inwardly very far away, while almost nobody notices, sometimes not even them. This is the quiet tragedy of functional absence. The body continues, the role continues, the tasks continue, the calendar continues, the job continues, the parenting continues, the relationship continues, the messages continue, the day continues, and somewhere underneath all of that, the person has become hard to reach, not gone, not deadened beyond return, but unavailable in the deeper sense. This is why episode 4 and this episode relate to each other. In episode 4, we explored autopilot living, how repetition, role, and adaptation can begin living for us. Here, the picture becomes even more intimate and more painful, because sometimes the person is not only living on autopilot, sometimes they are living on autopilot while inwardly absent. The role is still functioning, but the one inside the role is no longer fully participating. That can happen at work very easily. A person can keep showing up every day, answering every email, attending every meeting, using the right tone, saying the right words, managing the right outputs, and still feel as though none of it is truly reaching them anymore. They know how to be competent, the professional one, the calm one, the one who gets on with it. And because that part of the self is so well practiced, it can carry them for a long time. But carrying is not the same as a present. A person can sound coherent and still feel unreal. They can remain productive and still feel disconnected. They can continue managing complexity while inwardly growing flatter and more distant. That is why function alone tells us very little about contact. Modern life often mistakes function for health. If you are still getting things done, people assume you are coping. If you are still turning up, people assume you are okay. If you are still smiling, still saying all good, still keeping the machine running, then your absence becomes socially invisible. In some settings, it is not only invisible, it is rewarded. The colleague who never seems affected. The parent who keeps everything together. The partner who stays practical. The caregiver who keeps giving. The leader who remains composed. The friend who never asks for much. All of these can become socially admired forms of functional absence. Because they are admired, people can begin building an identity around them, not because they are consciously deceptive, but because the role that works becomes easier to inhabit than the self that hurts. This can happen in parenting in particularly painful ways. A parent may continue doing everything required: feeding, scheduling, organizing, driving, soothing, providing, helping, managing, and still feel strangely absent from the emotional experience of it. They are there in duty, but not always there in immediacy. They may love their child deeply and still feel disconnected from their own tenderness, delight, or emotional responsiveness because the system is operating in survival mode. The practical self is carrying the role, but the inwardly reachable self is harder to access. That can create enormous shame, because now the person is not only absent, they feel guilty about being absent. They tell themselves, I should feel more. I should be more available. Why am I so flat? What kind of person does this make me? But the issue is often not a lack of love. It is a lack of access that distinction matters. Because if the person mistakes reduced access for reduced care, they begin attacking themselves for something that may actually be a sign of overload, burnout, contradiction, or prolonged self-suppression. The same is true in relationships. A person can remain relationally there on paper while being inwardly gone. They answer the messages. They share the bed. They discuss plans. They remember birthdays. They do the practical things. They say love you. They keep the structure intact. yet something more alive is not arriving. There is no real inward meeting, no emotional permeability, no felt vulnerable, no ease of access to longing, grief, fear, tenderness, or truth. What remains is the shape of the relationship without the deeper contact that gives the shape life. This is one reason people often say things like, I don't know what's wrong, we're still together, but something feels missing, or I'm here, but I'm not really here. That sentence says more than it first appears to. Because I'm here, but I'm not really here is almost the definition of functional absence. It means the role has remained, the person has not fully. Perhaps one of the most painful parts of this is that others may not know how to respond to it. The absent person often looks cold, distant, unavailable, vague, or uninterested from the outside. The people who love them may feel shut out, confused, rejected, or emotionally starved. They may think, you're right here, why can't I reach you? And in many cases, the absent person is asking the same thing inwardly. I'm right here, why can't I reach me? That is the heartbreak of this state. It is not always that someone has chosen distance in the ordinary sense. Sometimes, distance has become the only way the system knows how to remain standing, and that is why functional absence can persist for so long, because it works just well enough. It keeps the person employed, keeps the family system stable, keeps the responsibilities met, keeps the image intact, keeps the social world from having to deal with visible collapse. But the cost builds quietly. Joy becomes harder to feel, desire becomes harder to locate, anger becomes vague or inaccessible, grief stays half buried, rest does not feel like rest. Love may remain conceptually real, but emotionally difficult to inhabit. The person becomes more and more adapted outwardly, and more unreachable inwardly. This is often where burnout and dissociation overlap in very subtle ways. A person becomes chronically efficient, chronically useful, chronically responsive, chronically available to others, but unavailable to themselves. They lose the sense of direct participation. Their life begins to feel managed rather than lived. Not because nothing is happening, but because too much has been happening for too long without enough return to contact. What is especially difficult is that many people mistake this state for adulthood. They think this is just what life is. This is what being responsible means. This is just how people get through things. Maybe this is maturity, less feeling, more functioning. But that is not the whole truth. Responsibility is real. Duty is real. Adaptation is real. But if a person must disappear inwardly to remain outwardly functional, then something essential is being lost in the process. That loss may not be visible immediately. Sometimes it appears first as boredom, a strange dullness, a lack of excitement, a lack of real rest, a sense of being unfulfilled but not knowing why, a sense that nothing is deeply wrong and yet something is profoundly missing. This is because the person is no longer only carrying tasks, they are carrying distance, and distance is heavy in its own way. Not sharp, not dramatic, but heavy. It weighs on spontaneity, on closeness, on creativity, on sexual aliveness, on play, on grief, on intimacy, on the ability to say with directness, this is what I feel, this is what I want, this is too much, this matters, this hurts, this is true. All of those require access. And access is exactly what functional absence reduces. This is why some people begin to feel like strangers to themselves, not because they have lost their identity in some abstract philosophical way, but because they no longer know how to find themselves through feeling. They can tell you what they do. They can tell you what others need from them. They can tell you the story of their life they are living. But if you ask what is alive in them now, there may be a long silence. That silence is not emptiness of soul. It is often a disconnection from access. The person has become reachable by role and unreachable by presence. And when that goes on long enough, even spontaneity can start feeling foreign. Spontaneous joy feels strange. Spontaneous grief feels disruptive. Spontaneous desire feels confusing. Spontaneous rest feels guilty. Spontaneous tenderness feels risky, because the whole person has become organized around continuity, function, and control. This is why quiet absence can become self-reinforcing. The longer someone lives this way, the more unfamiliar direct contact becomes. And the more unfamiliar it becomes, the more the person relies on the function to keep going. So the system circles back into the same pattern. Stay useful, stay composed, stay available in form, stay absent in depth, until one day, perhaps quietly, the person begins to realize that they no longer know the difference between coping and living. That is often the beginning of waking up, not a dramatic awakening, not an instant transformation, but a painful honesty, an honesty that says, I have kept going, but I have not really been here. I have maintained the shape of my life, but I have not fully inhabited it. I have been reachable to others in the practical sense, but difficult for me to find. I have become functional, but gone. That sentence is painful, but it is also important, because once functional absence is recognized, it is no longer total. Once the person can name the distance stops being completely invisible. Once they can say, I think I'm here in body, but not fully in self, the possibility of return begins. That is why this section matters so much. Not to condemn the person for how they survived, not to shame competence, not to dismiss the practical miracles people perform every day under enormous strain, but to say this clearly. A person can remain outwardly available while inwardly far away. And if that is true, then function must never again be mistaken for the whole truth of presence. because some of the most capable people in the world are carrying a quiet absence that almost no one can see, including sometimes themselves. And if that is the case, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What does it cost to live like that for too long, to keep functioning, keep showing up, keep doing what needs to be done, while slowly becoming more distant from the life you are living? The cost of quiet absence is not always obvious at first. That is part of what makes it so dangerous. If something breaks loudly, we tend to notice. If a person becomes visibly unstable, highly distressed, unable to function, or suddenly overwhelmed, the problem enters the room in a way that is difficult to ignore. But a quiet absence does not usually arrive like that. It enters life softly. It settles in. It keeps the external structure moving while slowly reducing the felt life inside it. And because the outer life may continue looking intact, the deeper cost can remain unnamed for a very long time. But the cost is real. It is paid in muted aliveness, muted joy, muted grief, muted anger, muted longing, muted truth. Not because these things disappear completely, but because they become harder to access, harder to trust, harder to inhabit directly. That is one of the most painful things about long-term dissociative distance. It protects, but it impoverishes. It may protect a person from being overwhelmed by pain, but it often protects them from being fully reached by life as well. Over time, that creates a peculiar kind of suffering, not always dramatic misery, often something quieter, a low-grade unreality, a sense of being disconnected without being able to explain from what, a sense that the life you are living no longer quite touches you in the way it should. Some people describe this as emptiness, not emptiness in the philosophical or spiritual sense, but a flatter, lonelier kind of emptiness. The feeling that something should be there and isn't, the feeling that meaning has thinned out. That connection has become conceptual rather than felt, that even when good things happen, they do not land properly, that even when bad things happen, they remain strangely distant, as though part of the system has already decided not to let them in fully. This can be deeply confusing, because people often assume that if they are no longer suffering intensely, they must be doing better. But the absence of acute distress is not the same as the presence of real contact. A person may no longer be flooded, but still be far away. They may no longer be panicking, but still feel unreal. They may no longer be crying, but still be unable to reach the grief that has shaped their whole body. That is why a quiet absence can produce a very specific kind of alienation. A person becomes a stranger to themselves, not because they have lost some mystical essence, but because the ordinary pathways of self-contact have become faint. They may know what they are supposed to feel, but not feel it. They may know something matters, but not be able to enter the matter fully. They may know they are loved, but be unable to take love in. They may know they are exhausted, but still not know how to rest deeply. They may know they are angry, but have no living access to anger. They may know they are sad, but remain dry and emotionally distant from the sadness itself. That kind of alienation is difficult to explain to people who have not lived it, because from the outside it may look like passivity, indifference, or even coldness. But from the inside, it often feels more like being locked out of one's own depth. Once that happens, life can start to become procedural. The person still knows how to move, still knows how to answer, still knows how to keep things going, still knows how to function. But the capacity to rest inwardly, to feel directly, to be touched, to be moved, to grieve, to desire, to delight, to melt, to soften, to remain with truth in an embodied way, these capacities become less accessible. That has consequences for relationships too, because if you are hard to reach in yourself, you become hard to reach with others. A person may remain loyal, helpful, reliable, and physically present, but the deeper currents of intimacy begin to suffer. Emotional reciprocity becomes harder, vulnerability becomes harder, spontaneous affection may feel harder, sexual presence may diminish, conflict may become harder to resolve, not only because there is pain, but because one or both people are no longer fully there to process the pain. This is how quiet absence can create loneliness even in connected lives. You can be partnered and still feel profoundly alone. You can be surrounded by family and still feel unreal. You can be loved and still not feel reached. You can give care and still feel absent from your own tenderness. And because the problem is distance rather than chaos, it can remain hidden beneath the ordinary language of adulthood. I'm just tired. I'm just not very emotional. I've got a lot on. I don't know. I'm a bit numb lately. I think I just need some rest. Rest may help, of course. But when absence has become a way of surviving, ordinary rest often does not fully solve the problem. That is another cost. The person may no longer know how to rest in a real sense. They may stop working, but not come back into contact. They may lie down, but not soften. They may have free time, but not feel more alive in it. They may remove the demand, but remain in the distance. That can create another level of despair, because now even relief does not restore what has been lost. And when that happens, people sometimes begin fearing that the numbness is who they are. That is perhaps the deepest cost of all. Protective absence becomes identity, not because it truly is identity, but because it has lasted long enough to feel permanent. The person starts saying, maybe I'm just like this now. Maybe this is my personality. Maybe I don't feel deeply anymore. Maybe I'm just detached. Maybe this is all life is now. That is where quiet absence becomes existential, not only painful, not only strange, but ontological. It starts altering the person's sense of what kind of being they are. And this is why it must be met carefully, because if someone is already far from themselves, and then they begin telling themselves that the distance is their essence, the possibility of return becomes harder to imagine. But the state is not the whole self. That needs to be said plainly. Distance may be what is most available right now. Numbness may be the most survivable state right now. Flatness may be what the system knows how to do. But that does not mean aliveness is gone. It may be buried, muted, protected, hard to reach, but not necessarily lost. And this is why the cost, painful as it is, can also become a signal. The emptiness, the unreality, the difficulty resting, the inability to access grief or desire, the sense of being present but not here, the sense of living at a distance from your own life. These are not only defects, they are communications, not in a romanticized sense, not as though suffering is noble by default, but as indications that something in you has gone so quiet in order to survive that the whole system is now paying for the protection. That is the tragedy and the tenderness of quiet absence. It kept you going, and it cost you contact. It protected you from pain, and it reduced your access to life. It helped you function, and it made it harder for you to find. That is the cost. And once that becomes visible, even a little, the whole question begins to change. Not why am I so broken, but what in me has gone quiet for too long. Not why can't I feel properly, but what has my system had to mute to carry all this? Not is this all I am now, but what might begin to return if absence no longer had to do all the protecting on its own. That is where this episode needs to land before the integration begins, because the cost of quiet absence is real. It is sobering. It is relational, emotional, and existential, but it is not meaningless. Sometimes the pain of distance is the first sign that some part of you no longer wants merely to survive. It wants to come back. Integration, learning to notice absence without becoming it. So where does all of this leave us? If some forms of protection arrive as heat and others arrive as distance, then a more conscious life requires that we learn to recognize not only when we become intense, but when we quietly disappear. That is the movement this episode has been building toward. Not toward shame, not toward panic, not toward turning every quiet mood into pathology, but toward recognition. Because absence becomes less total the moment it is noticed. That matters more than it may seem. Many people think the moment they recognize numbness, distance, or dissociation, they should immediately know how to fix it. They think that if they have language for it, they should be able to step cleanly back into full presence. But that is rarely how it works. The return is often gentler than that, slower, less dramatic, more like a reintroduction than a rescue. It begins with honesty. The honesty to say, I am here, but not fully here. I am functioning, but not in deep contact. I am speaking, but something in me has gone quiet. I may be calling this peace, but I think it is distant. I may be calling this maturity, but I think it is reduced access. That honesty is not a small thing, because quiet absence thrives on invisibility. It stays powerful when it goes unnamed. It keeps shaping the person's life while remaining hidden inside habits, roles, competence, and the ordinary language of coping. So the moment a person can recognize the absence clearly enough to describe it, something has already changed. The state is no longer the whole field. There is no awareness of the state. That awareness matters because it is already a form of return, not a full return, not a perfect return, but return in principle. The person who can say, I feel numb, is not fully lost in numbness. The person who can say, I think I have left the room inwardly, is already noticing the room again. The person who can say, I cannot reach myself easily right now, has already found some small contact with the fact of their distance. This is where compassion becomes essential, because if we meet absence with contempt, we usually deepen it. If the person says, why am I like this? What is wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal, present, available, alive? The state often becomes more defended, not less. Self-attack does not usually coax the system back into presence. It often confirms why presence felt too costly in the first place. So the work is not to force the self back into full feeling all at once. It is to become a trustworthy witness to the quietness, to notice. When the voice goes flat, when the body feels far away, when the room starts losing depth, when you become mechanically helpful, when you say, I'm fine, and feel nothing behind it, when your role remains active, but your inward participation is fading. This kind of noticing is not dramatic, but it is powerful, because often the earliest movements of return do not look like emotional breakthroughs. They look like subtler things, a little more honesty, a little less pretending, a little more awareness of what is happening in the body, a little more willingness to admit, I do not think I am as present as I look, a little more care around overload, a little less identification with the distance as personality. That last one matters a great deal. If a person believes that numbness is simply who they are, then they stop looking for conditions. They stop asking what narrows access, what protects, what overwhelms, what deadens, what might soften the system enough for contact to begin returning. But if numbness is understood as a state, even a recurring, familiar, well-practiced one, then something else becomes possible. Inquiry. Not, what is wrong with me? But, what happens to me under strain? What makes me go flat? What overwhelms me in quiet ways? What kind of pressures make me leave the room inwardly? Where in my life am I still present in function but absent in feeling? These are not accusatory questions. They are orienting ones. They begin to turn absence into something readable. And once something becomes readable, it becomes less frightening, This is especially important because many people fear their own distance. They worry that numbness means they do not care, that dissociation means they are broken, that quiet absence means they have lost something essential forever. But very often, what they are looking at is not permanent damage in the simple sense. It is a system that has become organized around protection. And systems organized around protection do not return through force. They return through conditions. Conditions of enough safety, enough slowness, enough truth, enough relief from constant performance, enough permission not to be in the role all the time, enough support to let more of the self come back online. This is why the integration here is not a command. It is an invitation to notice the moments where you go quiet inside, an invitation to recognize when calm has become flattening, an invitation to track the places where you are outwardly available but inwardly hard to reach, an invitation to stop worshipping functionality as proof of presence, an invitation to become gently suspicious of any state that looks clean on the surface but leaves you less reachable to yourself, because the goal is not endless self-monitoring. The goal is a relationship to the parts of you that disappear under pressure, relationship to the forms of silence that are not peace, relationship to the quietness that once protected you and may still be trying to. And perhaps this is the deepest integration of all. Quiet absence is not a failure of character. It is often a survival intelligence that has gone on too long. It is the mind and body reducing contact because full contact once cost too much. And the beginning of change is not violence toward that adaptation, but the courage to notice it without becoming it completely. That is where this episode lands. Not with a perfect method, not with instant restoration, but with a more humane kind of awareness. The awareness to say, I see the distance. I understand a little more why it came. I do not need to confuse it with peace, and I do not need to confuse it with the whole truth of who I am. That is a serious beginning, because once absence is recognized, the possibility of return is already alive. So this episode has been about a form of self-protection that is easy to miss because it often looks so quiet from the outside. We've explored dissociation, numbness, quiet absence, emotional flattening, hypoarousal distance, and the ways a person can remain outwardly functional while inwardly far away. We looked at how not all overwhelm becomes louder. Some of it becomes quieter. Some of it reduces access rather than increasing intensity. Some of it protects by dimming the field instead of flooding it. We explored what dissociation actually is, not simply the absence of feeling, but often the absence of access. We looked at why the mind and body leave the moment, why numbness is not the same as peace, how a person can become highly functional while inwardly gone, and what it costs to live too long in that quiet absence. And through all of it, one thing becomes clearer. A person can be physically present and emotionally distant, capable and unreachable, calm-looking and shut down, useful and quietly lost to themselves. That does not mean they are empty. It does not mean they do not care. It does not mean the self has disappeared beyond return. It often means that the system has learned to survive by lowering contact. That is the tenderness in this episode, because once we understand quiet absence as protection, we stop treating it as simple failure. We stop praising it blindly as peace. We stop misreading it as maturity when it is really distance. And perhaps most importantly, we stop assuming that the person in that state can be reached through pressure, shame, or argument. The return begins elsewhere. It begins in recognition, in gentleness, in conditions, in noticing, in refusing to confuse numbness with the final truth. Some people do not disappear because they do not care. They disappear because too much has mattered for too long without enough room to stay fully present to it. Once that is understood, quiet absence becomes not the end of the story, but the beginning of a more honest one. In the next episode, we move from absence into a very different question: flow, presence, and the states we chase. Because if some states make us disappear, other states make us feel more intensely here, more immersed, more alive, more focused, more energized, more gathered, more ourselves, at least on the surface. In episode 8, we'll explore what happens when consciousness feels heightened rather than flattened. We'll look at immersion, flow, aliveness, intensity, and peak states, but also at the subtle danger of chasing states simply because they make us feel more real. Because not every heightened state is a true presence. Not every immersive state is freedom, and not every form of intensity that feels alive is actually widening consciousness healthily. We'll ask what flow really is, what presence actually feels like. Why do some states feel almost sacred in their depth, and why do others become addictive because they temporarily rescue us from flatness, numbness, boredom, or inner fragmentation? So after this episode on absence, the next one asks a different question. What happens when consciousness feels vividly, compellingly, almost magnetically alive? And how do we tell the difference between genuine presence and the states we chase because they make us feel less absent? That is where we go next. So as we end this episode, I leave you with this. Notice the quietness that feels alive and the quietness that feels far away. Notice the moments when you remain functional but hard to reach. Notice the parts of you that go flat under pressure, the parts that disappear politely, the parts that stay in role while leaving the room inwardly, not to judge them, not to force them back, but to begin recognizing them clearly enough that they are no longer invisible. Because what is noticed can be met, what is met can soften, and what softens may, in time, begin to return. Notice when absence starts calling itself peace. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 7, Dissociation, Numbness, and Quiet Absence. I'm James Miller.